The neighborhood of Crestwood Pines had always been a quiet, tree-lined enclave where the residents prided themselves on pristine lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, and a sense of order that felt almost timeless. But in the spring of last year, something began to disrupt the peace in ways no one could have anticipated. Something so seemingly harmless that at first, most people brushed it off as nothing more than a fleeting nuisance, until that nuisance swelled into an all-out neighborhood war that would consume the lives of dozens of families, test the limits of their HOA's authority, and draw national attention as a case study in just how fragile suburban harmony could be when fun collided with control. For it all began when the HOA board, eager to modernize the neighborhood and appeal to younger families, approved the installation of 2 brand-new pickleball courts near the community park, a decision that was initially celebrated with balloons, flyers, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony because pickleball had been spreading like wildfire across the country, marketed as the perfect sport for all ages, combining elements of tennis, badminton, and ping-pong into a fast-paced yet accessible game, and soon after the courts opened, crowds of neighbors began to gather daily with paddles in hand, laughter echoing, balls popping crisply against paddles, and cheers ringing out whenever someone managed a clever volley. But beneath the cheerful surface, a problem was brewing. For the game was much louder than anyone had expected. The sharp pop, pop, pop of the hard plastic ball slapping against the paddles reverberated off nearby houses, bouncing across fences and through windows, and what began as mild irritation for some quickly turned into sleepless nights, angry confrontations, and calls to the HOA demanding action, especially from longtime residents who had moved to Crestwood Pines precisely for its tranquility. People like Margaret Fulton, a retired librarian who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years and whose home sat directly across from the courts, and who began keeping a journal documenting the exact time she was disturbed by the noise, meticulously writing entries. Like 7:02 a.m., first game starts, can't concentrate on reading, and 9:47 p.m., still playing, windows rattling, and she wasn't alone, because soon dozens of others were filing complaints. From parents of infants who claimed their babies couldn't nap because of the constant popping to night shift workers who said their only rest hours were being stolen by the endless games. And while the HOA board initially dismissed these complaints as exaggerated, arguing that pickleball was community building and good for property values, the discontent grew louder than the games themselves, leading to raucous HOA meetings where one side shouted about freedom, fitness, and fun, while the other side screamed about noise ordinances, personal rights, and the erosion of peace. And somewhere in the middle were neighbors who didn't care much either way but were forced to choose sides as the tension grew unbearable, until finally the board, under immense pressure, decided to experiment with restricted hours only, allowing games between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m., a compromise that satisfied no one. Because the enthusiasts complained their evening matches were being stolen, and the opponents argued the noise was still intolerable, and so the conflict escalated, with residents beginning to take matters into their own hands. One morning, players showed up to find locks on the courts cut and nets slashed. Another time, someone scattered nails and glass across the playing surface, and in retaliation, the pickleballers organized petitions, demanding the HOA expand the courts and even threatening legal action against anyone caught vandalizing, while behind closed doors, the HOA board fractured, with some members advocating total removal of the courts and others secretly planning to install even more as a way to attract younger buyers. And into this swirling storm of grievances stepped a new figure, a man named David Rourke, a corporate attorney who had moved into Crestwood Pines only 6 months earlier and who had quickly established himself as a charismatic leader of the pro-pickleball faction, arguing passionately that those who opposed the sport were relics of the past trying to suppress progress, while on the other side, Margaret Fulton became the de facto general of the anti-noise faction, rallying retirees, parents, and night shifters under a banner of quiet rights. and soon flyers began appearing in mailboxes painting one side as tyrants and the other as anarchists. And the once friendly neighborhood block parties were replaced by icy stares, whispered gossip, and confrontations so heated that police were called more than once to break up disputes outside the courts. But the police themselves could do little, as pickleball fell into a strange gray area where local noise ordinances were difficult to enforce, leaving the HOA as the sole authority in the matter, and the HOA, sensing its power tested, began drafting new enforcement policies that many residents considered draconian, including heavy fines for unauthorized play, the installation of surveillance cameras around the courts, and even the proposal to create a volunteer noise compliance committee that would patrol and report violations, something that critics argued made the HOA look less like a homeowners association and more like a private police force. And while these measures were debated, resentment reached a boiling point one night when, during a thunderstorm, a group of unknown individuals cut the power to the court lights, spray-painted "No Peace, No Play" across the asphalt, and left behind a bag filled with shattered paddles as a warning, sparking rumors of a secret vigilante group rising within Crestwood Pines determined to shut pickleball down by any means necessary. And when the board president, Sandra Lowe, called an emergency meeting to address the vandalism, hundreds of residents crammed into the clubhouse, shouting over one another as the debate spiraled into chaos, with Margaret Fulton standing and demanding immediate closure of the courts for the sake of sanity, while David Rourke countered with a booming voice that those courts represented freedom and community spirit. And as the shouting match escalated, someone threw a paddle across the room, striking a board member in the head and sending the meeting into pandemonium, with people storming out, others threatening lawsuits, and whispers spreading that Crestwood Pines was no longer a community but a battleground. And as the night ended with flashing police lights outside the clubhouse and neighbors refusing to speak to one another, a new chapter in the war over pickleball was written, one that would not only test the authority of the HOA, but would expose deep rifts in the very fabric of suburban America, setting the stage for what many would later call the noise battle that tore Crestwood apart, a conflict that was only just beginning and would soon spiral far beyond noise complaints into legal warfare, personal vendettas, and shocking betrayals that no one in the neighborhood had ever imagined possible. In the weeks that followed the first wave of tensions, the neighborhood surrounding the pickleball courts turned into a simmering battleground where whispered complaints became loud arguments and casual remarks at the mailboxes transformed into pointed accusations. And it seemed as though the spirit of community that had once defined Maplewood Estates was being eroded by the constant clatter of plastic balls against paddles and the echo of frustrated voices carried through otherwise quiet streets. For while some residents were energized by the newfound popularity of pickleball, others were at their wits' end, struggling to reconcile the intrusion of what felt like relentless noise into their carefully maintained suburban peace. And as the HOA convened to deliberate over the growing number of complaints, it became clear that the pickleball dispute was no longer about a simple game, but rather a proxy war for deeper divisions within the neighborhood, pitting those who valued recreation, socialization, and new traditions against those who clung to the sanctity of quiet, privacy, and the long-standing expectations of the community's lifestyle. And it was during this period that Richard, the HOA president, found himself thrust unwillingly into the role of mediator and judge. His email inbox flooded with grievances ranging from the relatively minor, "I cannot hear my television during matches," to the ominously aggressive, "If something isn't done, I'll take care of this myself." Each message a snapshot of fraying tempers and collapsing patience. And Richard, once a man who enjoyed the perks of his leadership role, such as presiding over barbecues and ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new landscaping projects, now dreaded the responsibilities that came with wielding power in a divided community. Yet he was also unwilling to admit that he was in over his head, because deep down he believed that if he could navigate this conflict successfully, It would secure his legacy and bolster his reputation beyond Maplewood Estates, perhaps even into the broader world of HOA leadership, which was something he secretly aspired to. So instead of seeking a quick compromise, he leaned into the drama, treating the conflict as an opportunity to cement his control, though he underestimated the ferocity with which both sides would fight for what they saw as their rights. 4. When the pro-pickleball faction began organizing matches into tournaments, complete with flyers, sponsorships from a local sporting goods store, and even trophies for winners, the anti-pickleball faction responded with equal determination, hiring a sound engineer to measure the decibel levels of the games and filing a formal noise complaint with the city, claiming the courts violated zoning ordinances, and what might have been settled with a scheduling compromise spiraled into an all-out escalation, with late-night meetings held in living rooms, secret group chats buzzing with strategies, and homeowners openly declaring alliances as though Maplewood Estates had been split into two camps, while Richard sat at the center, feeding the fire by stalling decisions, promising both sides that their voices would be heard and quietly reveling in the sense of importance the conflict gave him. Though beneath the surface the tension was becoming dangerous, for it wasn't just about noise anymore, it was about power, identity, and who truly controlled the future of the neighborhood. And as the first lawsuit was drafted and rumors of sabotage began circulating, paddles stolen from garages, cars keyed in the parking lot near the courts, even reports of a resident releasing their dog during a match to disrupt play, it became clear that the pickleball war was no passing quarrel, but a full-fledged battle with stakes that threatened to tear Maplewood Estates apart in ways no one had anticipated, setting the stage for a climax that would pit neighbor against neighbor, HOA politics against municipal law, and recreation against the very fabric of community itself. Until there could be no middle ground, only winners and losers in a war sparked by the sound of a plastic ball echoing across an asphalt court. By the time autumn rolled around and the leaves in Maplewood Estates had shifted to shades of amber and crimson, the once idyllic community had become an armed camp, divided not by fences or property lines, but by loyalty to either silence or pickleball, with each side convinced that the other represented not merely an inconvenience, but an existential threat to their way of life. And as the lawsuits progressed, one filed by the anti-pickleball faction, demanding immediate closure of the courts. Another filed by the pro-pickleball group accusing the HOA of discriminatory restrictions. Richard, the embattled HOA president, found himself facing not just angry emails and late-night knocks on his door, but actual threats to his leadership. For whispers of a recall election began circulating in both camps, each side believing that if they could install their own representative at the helm of the HOA, they could end the conflict on their terms. And this looming vote transformed the courts into a symbol of power greater than anyone had expected, with lawn signs sprouting up across front yards declaring allegiance, "Keep the courts!" in bright neon letters versus "Peace over pickleball" painted in calming blues, and neighbors who once shared cookouts and Christmas decorations now crossing the street to avoid eye contact, while children who had grown up playing together were pulled apart as their parents forbade them from consorting with the enemy, creating a ripple effect of division that spread far beyond the courts themselves. And it was in this tense atmosphere that the pro-pickleball faction made a daring move by organizing what they called the Maplewood Open, a community-wide tournament designed not just to showcase the sport, but to draw regional attention, inviting local news stations, city council members, and even a state senator rumored to be considering legislation supporting recreational courts in suburban neighborhoods. And while the event promised to elevate the sport's legitimacy, it also threatened to deal a final, devastating blow to the anti-pickleball camp, who saw it as nothing short of a hostile takeover. So in retaliation, they staged nightly protests outside the courts, complete with megaphones, handmade signs, and even a drum circle that ironically produced more noise than the games they were protesting, and the situation escalated when one Particularly heated night ended in shoving, an overturned water cooler, and the arrival of police cruisers whose flashing lights illuminated the fractures of a community on the brink of collapse. And yet Richard, watching all this unfold from the HOA clubhouse, saw opportunity where others saw chaos. For he realized that if he could somehow seize control of the narrative and position himself as the one man capable of restoring order, he might not only survive the recall but emerge as a hero, and so he plotted in secret, arranging for the HOA to partner with the city on a noise abatement study, while simultaneously negotiating with the pro-pickleball sponsors to secure personal favors, ensuring that whichever side prevailed, his fingerprints would be on the victory. But what Richard failed to anticipate was that the residents themselves were growing weary of being manipulated, and a quiet coalition began forming. Neighbors from both camps who were tired of the endless conflict, who saw the absurdity of families torn apart over the bounce of a ball, and who believed that Richard himself was the real problem, not the courts, not the noise, but the unchecked power of an HOA president who thrived on division. And when the recall election finally came to a vote, turnout was unprecedented, with nearly every homeowner showing up to cast their ballot. The atmosphere charged like a courtroom awaiting a verdict, and when the results were tallied, the announcement shocked everyone. Richard had not only been recalled but barred from holding any future office within the HOA, his downfall sealed, not by the noise of pickleball but by the silence of unity against manipulation. And in the aftermath, with the leadership void filled by a compromise committee made up of representatives from both camps, a new arrangement was struck that allowed pickleball games during set hours, soundproof fencing and noise reduction surfacing installed around the courts, and quiet evenings guaranteed for those who valued peace, a solution that seemed almost laughably simple given the chaos that had preceded it, but the resolution carried deeper lessons. For Maplewood Estates would never be the same, its residents forever remembering how quickly neighbors could turn to enemies when power, pride, and identity were at stake, and though the court still rang with the familiar pop of ball against paddle, the echoes were softer now, tempered by a shared understanding of what the community had nearly lost, and on warm evenings when players laughed and spectators cheered, there lingered a sense of fragile harmony, as if everyone knew that beneath the surface, the potential for conflict still slumbered, waiting only for the next spark. Yet for now the neighborhood had reclaimed something of its soul, proving that even in the noisiest of battles, compromise could bring a measure of peace, though never without scars, and thus Maplewood Estates entered a new chapter, not defined by victory or defeat, but by the uneasy truce forged out of the clamor of pickleball and the echoes of what it nearly destroyed.